Dr. Jim Johnson is from the University of North Carolina. James Johnson is the William R. Keenan Jr. Distinguished Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship and Director of Urban Investment Strategies Center at the Frank Hawkins Keenan Institute of Private Enterprise. Mr. Johnson's research includes community and economic development, the effects of demographic changes on the U.S. workplace, as well as the interethnic minority conflict in advanced industrial societies. Mr. Johnson has published more than 100 scholarly research articles and 3 research monographs, and has co-edited 4 theme issues of scholarly journals on these related topics. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I am delighted to be with you and have the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, the world, but especially our country, every region and every state, including the great state of California, in the midst of an unprecedented demographic transformation. The kinds of changes we find ourselves in the midst of, you're going to have to buckle your seatbelt to deal with them. And if you ignore them at your own peril. There are lots of things we can debate politically today. I want to suggest to you that basic demography is not one of them. I assure you, if you're 5 years old today, 5 years from now, you're going to be 10 years old. Your birthday comes the same time every year. You just add 1 to what it was last year, and voila, you got it. In fact, every year when I walk in for my annual review with my dean, I walk out with a big raise. Because I walk in and say, you know, help me out, son. Thank you. I said, you know, I walk in and says, you know, I was 62 years old last year when we met. You know what? I'm 63 now. And you know what? When we meet next year, I'm going to be 64. It's called forecasting. I'm the best in the business. The kinds of changes we find ourselves in the midst of, we call them disruptive demographic changes because they're going to dramatically transform all of our social, economic, and political institutions. They're going to transform the workforce. They're going to transform workplaces. They're going to transform consumer markets. Everything is going to change. And what I would like to do in the time allotted me, I want to talk about the 6 disruptive demographics that are going to change us forever. I want to talk about what those trends are. I want to talk about what challenges and opportunities there are undergirding those shifts, then wrap up by talking about what it all means for the accounting profession. Hopefully there'll be time for us to think about these issues. I'm going to be drawing on the decennial census. As you know, every 10 years we conduct a full enumeration of our population. The last one was in 2010. How many of you completed your 2010 census form? Show your hand. Don't lie, I got your iris retinal scan, I'll go check. If you remember the form, it was 1 page, front and back. Depending on the number of crumb snatchers you have in your household, it took between about 10 seconds and about 15 seconds to finish that thing. Radically different from earlier censuses because in earlier censuses there was something called the census long form. And the emphasis was really on long, because you needed breakfast, you needed lunch, you needed dinner, and about 3 stiff drinks to finish that thing. They wanted to know about your firstborn, your lastborn, the one you don't own up to. Everything in your business they wanted to know about in the census long form. We don't do the census long form in the decennial census anymore because we have a different way of collecting data today called the American Community Survey, which is in essence that census long form. But the good thing is the ACS, the American Community Survey, is administered to a representative sample of the US population on an annual basis. So we no longer have to wait 10 years to figure out what the big trends are. Those of us who are pointy-headed academics who like demography, we're in demographic heaven. We just get to monitor stuff. So what I will be doing in making the case for you today, 2 decennial censuses, the 2000 and the 2010, and I'll be relying on the American Community Survey from 2010 to 2016 in terms of the data that we'll share with you. I don't know what's wrong with this thing. Huh? If you face this way. I gotta face that way? Yeah. Oh. There are 6 trends. I'm gonna list them and we'll talk about them. The first one is the South rises again. Second one is the Browning of America. The third one is marrying out is in. The fourth one is the silver tsunami is about to hit. Buckle your seatbelt. The fifth one is, the end of men. I didn't make it up. It's actually the title of a book by a writer named Hannah Rosen. She's a writer for the Atlantic. She preceded publication of the book with 2 articles in the Atlantic magazine. If you have time to read the book, I highly recommend it. The first one was by that title, The End of Men. The second article was called Boys on the Side. It'll become apparent what I'm talking about in a moment. I only had one disagreement with Hannah when she wrote the book. She had a period at the end of the sentence. Being a man, I refused to put a period at the end of the sentence, so we're going to see if this end of men thing has any juice in a minute. My last one is Cooling Water from Grandma's Well. Anybody know what that is? That's actually a song. I'm not going to sing it for you today, but Cooling Water from Grandma's Well and Grandpa's too. Let's talk about what each one of these things means. People on the move, the South rises again. This first big trend is about the Southern United States as defined by the Census Bureau. Those states in red there. If you know your history of the United States, you know that for much of the 20th century, this was an economically backwards region and had all kinds of economic problems, had all kinds of racial problems. I actually grew up in the South, in North Carolina. I went to high school in 1968, which means I was in the first wave of school integration in the South. Very interesting time, and I remember I was an athlete, football player, basketball, track, and I remember my first football game was an away game as a freshman in high school. And I remember when we arrived at the stadium, the KKK was marching outside the stadium, daring us to beat the opposing team. You know, youthful exuberance is something. We beat them so bad they couldn't spell KKK by the end of the night. But that was the South at the time. It was the place, it was a horrible place. I couldn't wait to leave when I graduated from college in 1975. Graduate school in Wisconsin, Madison, PhD, Michigan State, and then I came to California. I taught at UCLA for about 14 years. If you look at that region and take a long-range view, what you will see is the South only captured about 30% of net national population growth from the turn of the 20th century until about 1970. Because it was a place to leave. Everybody was leaving. To the extent that the region grew, it was an excess of births over deaths. And then something profound occurred. In every decade since 1970, the South has captured about half of net national population growth in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, we've gone from a region where we speak 2 languages, English and bad English, to one today we speak more than 300 different languages. We've become demographically the cat's meow in terms of destination selection in the region, including we added about 27, let me just, this thing, y'all make me work too hard here. We added about 27 million people to our population during the first decade of the new millennium, growing at 9.5%. What you will note is that 14.3 million of that 26 million people in the South. You note that the second most rapidly growing region was the West region of the state. Very, very slow growth in the Northeast, very, very slow growth in the Midwest. What share of growth did the South capture? About 53%. The West captured 32%. What we're talking about is a profound redistribution of population with a fundamental shift from the Northeast and the Midwest to the West and what? The South, where the South is tag you're it in terms of the kinds of changes that we find ourselves in the midst of. What's going on? Why would that be happening? It's all about migration and it's all about immigration. Look at the data. Look at the South, the only region where everybody was moving to in larger numbers than were leaving. Talk about total migrants. You talk about African Americans, you talk about Hispanics, Latinos, you talk about the elderly, you talk about the foreign-born. Everybody headed south in large numbers than were leaving. You can't say that about the West region. The West was losing what? It was losing Latinos, Hispanic Latinos. It was losing the elderly population. If you go to the Midwest during this period, the only group moving there in larger numbers leaving were the elderly. And this is a news flash. After this cold snap, they're going to be the heck out of there too, so you just watch on the way. And the Northeast is kind of like when the last person leaves, please turn off the lights if there's still any on there. Now, I know you all may not know this, but I will tell you, being from North Carolina, if you want to see this movement in action, all you got to do is pay attention to license tags in North Carolina. Not when you're driving, but in the parking lot, you see all those snowbirds left the Northeast. Now, some of them get confused when they leave the Northeast and they go to Florida. And they get down there and they figure out it's hot as you know what all the time. And half of them come back to North Carolina. They're called halfbacks. They're halfway back to New York, but they're settling in North Carolina. Profound kind of redistribution of population that is changing the next place. So but I lied to you. I told you it was the South. It's really not the South, ladies and gentlemen. This movement is about 4 states in the South. This movement is about Texas. It's about Florida. It's about Georgia and North Carolina. Those 4 states captured about 80% of that national growth of 14.3 million. The other southern states combined only about 29% of that growth. So it's not widely distributed. We talk about migration magnets. Those states are the ones that's driving kinds of changes. I stopped purposely at 2008 earlier because we had something called the Great Recession, and the question becomes, what happened to those trends during the Great Recession? What happened to migration and the like? The answer is a slowdown in the magnitude of movement, not a change in the trajectory of movement. Look at the data. If you look at the upper left-hand quadrant, you see right before the Great Recession, 2000, 2004, net gain of about 655,000 people. During the Great Recession, that population shift dropped. Florida flipped during the Great Recession from a net importer to a net exporter. Well, a lot of those people who moved to Florida with nice retirement portfolios, what happened to their retirement portfolios? They went further south. I'm going to show you that they're back in the workforce. They're called the newly unretired. And then there are a group of elderly people who moved to Florida who age to the level that they need caregiver support. And what do their caregivers say? We're not coming there. You have to come to where we are. And so understand I'm talking about long-range, long-term demographic trends, but those trends can be disrupted, interrupted with economic perturbations in our economy. Obviously, Florida is back being, but understand that notion. Look at the right-hand side. We've been pretty draconian on international migrants since 9/11. I want to suggest to you that that's not a good thing for us, and I'll make that case for you moving forward here. What's happened since 2010, look at California. California was growing at the nation about 9%. California was growing about 10%. 3.4 million people added to the population of the state during the first decade of the new millennium, while the West was growing a little bit more rapidly. What's happened in the nation since 2010 to 2015? We've added another 12 million people. 3.9% growth rate. Of that 12 million people, 6.3 million in the South, 3.9 million, close to 4 million out west. The same kind of trend that characterized the first decade of the new millennium is driving population change in the second decade of the new millennium. Under 1 million net gains in the Northeast and the Midwest. So that trend continues. 52% out south, 33% in the west. The same kind of thing that we've talked about earlier. Driving force. The only difference between the first decade and the mid-year of the second decade of the new millennium is not just Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. You have to add Virginia because the beltway in and around D.C. is growing like crazy. 80% of that growth concentrated in those places. So the trend continues in terms of all of the kinds of things we're talking about here. California, 2010 to 2016, another 1.9, about 2 million people. Your finance officer says it's 2.1 million, 5.4% growth rate, while the West is growing at 6.5%, much more rapidly than the nation as a whole in terms of the kinds of changes that we're talking about. Okay, big trend number one, this tremendous kind of redistribution of population. We actually compute something called a geographic centroid of our population, and if you track it historically, it's been moving from the Midwest to the Southwest. The geographic centroid of our population today is actually in rural Missouri. I predicted that it's going to be in Mexico by 2020. Y'all invite me to let me see back and see if it's right a little later on. Undergirding this redistribution trend are some profound changes in the racial and ethnic complexion of our population. Two colorful demographic processes I want to talk about. One is the browning of America, and the other one is the graying of America, and they both are occurring simultaneously for us in terms of the kinds of change. First, this browning of America is about immigration-driven population change, and to give you some sense of what I'm talking about here, I have to give you a quick immigration history. These are cartograms where we've exaggerated the size and shapes of foreign countries proportional to the number of legal immigrants we've invited to enter America. Everybody say legal. I'm talking about legal immigrants right now, okay? 3 graphics, 1921, 1960, 1961, 86, 87, and 98. Look at that first top panel if you're graphic, if you will, please. And what you will see is that most of the legal immigrants entering America between 1921 and 1960 came from where? Europe. Relatively few came from where? Asia, and a smaller share from Latin America compared to Europe, right? Ladies and gentlemen, that was an intentional pattern because until the mid-1960s, we had an immigration law in this country that said if we were going to allow the foreign-born to enter our country, it was important that they not upset the existing racial and ethnic balance of our country as it existed at the turn of the 20th century. So we had an express preference for people who were phenotypically similar to Anglo-Saxons. People would come to America, learn to speak English, anglicize their names, and this thing called a melting pot was supposed to work. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we operated on a quota system that was geographically discriminatory against people from certain regions of the world. In fact, if you go back into our immigration history to the 1880s, you will note that we had something called the Chinese exclusion law. They shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it would be, quote unquote, difficult to assimilate into mainstream society. Fast forward to the first decade of the 20th century, we defined and codified into law something called the Chinese, Asiatic barrier region that included Japan shouldn't be allowed to come to America because it'd be, quote unquote, difficult to assimilate into mainstream society. So we control the composition of our population through our immigration law. Fast forward to the middle panel in this graphic, you begin to see something interesting occur. What you will notice in that middle panel, that immigration from Europe shrinks relative to the earlier period, right? What begins to grow? Asia and Latin America assume greater ascendancy and importance in terms of our immigration history. How did that come about? It came about coincident with the civil rights movement in domestic life. In 1965, we liberalized our immigration law via something called the Hart-Celler Act of that year. Put a pin in it because it's one of the most profound pieces of legislation in our history that is literally responsible for the diversity of our population as we know it today. What did the Hart-Celler Act do? Eliminate those discriminatory provisions based on origin, opening up the doors of our country to people who heretofore had not been allowed to come in very large numbers, mainly people from Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. This is so profound a piece of legislation, we use 1965 as the dividing line to distinguish two groups of immigrants in America. Anybody arriving prior to 1965, we called them the old immigrants, and we refer to them further as the invisible minorities. Why invisible? Phenotypically similar to the Anglo-Saxon model. Once you anglicize your name, learn to speak the English and all of that, it's pretty difficult to distinguish where you're from. Anybody arriving since 1965, we refer to as the new immigrants, and we also refer to them further as the visible minorities, because why? From radically different regions of the world, radically different phenotype. Yes, they can go through the assimilation process, but you will always know that they're different. Why? Because their phenotype is different from the Anglo-Saxon model. Fast forward to the third panel in this graphic, what you will see is that immigration from Europe has literally almost disappeared. It looks a lot like immigration from Asia during the 20s. Ladies and gentlemen, since 1965, our major flows of immigrants in America have been primarily from Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. These are people of color who are transforming the complexion of our society. So takeaway number one, undergirds in the browning of America, fundamental shift in geographic origin. Takeaway number two, fundamental shift in phenotype. Takeaway number three, the numbers changed dramatically across those periods. Left-hand side of this graphic, 1920, 1961, we only allowed about 206,000 legal immigrants to enter our country on an annual basis. You see, over time, we've increased that number progressively from about 561,000 in the 60s to the early 90s, during the mid-90s to the mid-2000s in the 870-some thousand range, and since 2005, about 1 million to 1.1 million people entering our country through legal channels, all contributing to the growing diversity of our population. In the mid-1960s, we also acknowledged for the first time that we were a nation of immigrants, and then we said we should thus allow people who were being persecuted in their homelands for economic, political, or religious reasons, refugees, parolees, asylees, Those numbers fluctuate depending on the conditions around the world and depending on our proclivity for allowing people to enter our country, but the ones that we have allowed to enter have contributed to the growing diversity of our population. That's the law, ladies and gentlemen. That's the way it works. It's politically a hot potato today because now we want to reduce or cut international migration, legal migration, by about, 500,000 a year. We want to halve that flow. And I want to suggest to you that's not a good thing for us. And we got all kinds of constraints on other immigrants or refugees and the like coming to America and all this stuff. So it's controversial, but that's the law. What really gets controversial and get people's dandruff up is when you start talking about illegal immigration. Now, illegal immigration wasn't much of a problem in America prior to 1965 for two reasons: the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. You ever met anybody try to swim either one of those bodies in a ride? Just wasn't much of a problem. But since 1965, fundamental change in geographic origins and a southern border that has been relatively fluid, this thing called illegal immigration has assumed greater importance. Estimates 300,000 to 400,000 annually over the past 2 or 3 decades, people entering our country through unauthorized channels. The current controversy about unauthorized immigration in America is not new. When I was here in California in the 80s and early 90s, lots of discussions in this state about we got too many illegal immigrants. We need to do something to stem the tide. At that time, the federal government says, well, maybe if we saturate labor demand, if we fill every job in our economy, there'll be no reason for any unauthorized immigrant to enter our country. So what did we do? Via something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, we said to any person who was in America illegally, we said if you've been here illegally, you can document that you've been here illegally since before 1982, we will grant you amnesty, no questions asked. Well, how do you document that you've been here illegally since before 1982? Well, if you got a rent receipt, a clothing bill, a greasy receipt from Burger King, say I bought a Whopper in 1982. Federal government offer you amnesty, no questions asked. How many people came forward to accept the federal government's offer of amnesty? About 3 million people, all contributing to the growing diversity of our population. But understand that there were about 2.7 million people here illegally who did not trust the federal government enough to come forward. They said, I ain't going for the okadoke. You're not going to identify me and deport me. And they didn't go home either. So by 1996, we estimated that there were about 5 million people here illegally. And if you follow the debate since 2005, that number has ranged wildly between about 7 million and about 15 million. Now, I'm a business demographer, and I probably average, it's picked up lately, 3 to 5 calls a month from the media asking me how many illegal immigrants there are. And, being the dutiful academic that I am, you stay up all night figuring, blaze a path to the restroom, you get on a plane, you ask the flight attendant for a napkin because you want your numbers to be, good. And then I discovered that the only person who was getting old and ugly in this process was me. And so when anybody calls me now and asks me how many illegal immigrants in America, I just say a lot. The real number is about 11 million people, okay? Now, when you hear the debate about illegal immigration, what group are we talking about? Who are we talking about? Some person of Mexican descent surreptitiously crossing the Rio Grande, right? I want to suggest to you it's a little bit more complicated than that. But to get you to understand the complication, I got to confuse you a little bit. But it's not me confusing you, it's the way the numbers are gathered. Are you aware that there are a group of immigrants in America called non-immigrants? Huh? Non-immigrants are people we invite to America on a temporary basis. They enter on visas. There are at least 68 different categories of these folk, okay? Tourists, international students, foreign diplomats, and international baseball players. All enter America on temporary visas. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enter America on a 90-day tourist visa and you stay 91 days, what are you? No, you're called a visa overstayer. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, 40 to 45% of the illegal immigrants in America walk through the door with papers from the federal government. When it's time to go home, what do? They stay. Remember the terrorists of 9/11? 6 of them were here with temporary visas that hadn't expired. 3 of them fit the visa overstay category. When it was time to go home, they just blew us off and said, I'm staying. Another 6, we don't know how the heck they got here. And the last one came on a student visa, was supposed to come here to California to learn to read and speak English, but instead went to flight school in Florida. And we now know after the fact, because the flight school was a bit dubious of this guy because of his poor facility of English, they reported him to the Immigration Service, the Federal Aviation Administration. Anybody that would listen said, this guy wants to be a pilot, but he can't speak English and read it very well. The guy could speak English well enough to tell the flight school he had no interest in learning how to land planes, only to fly them. Why don't you hear much about this group? I didn't say 10%. I said what? 40 to 45% walk through the door with papers from the federal government. If you get nothing out of what I say today, other than this, is we're not having an honest discussion about illegal immigration. We've allowed one group to be persecuted in the process when close to half of them building your wall won't, not your wall, but building a wall will not solve your problem in terms of unauthorized immigration. And if you're worried about homeland security and the like, ladies and gentlemen, it's not probably the poor Mexican that you need to worry about. It's probably these folks. You know why? They come from all over the world. Please don't be offended by what I'm about to say, but they look a lot like y'all. In fact, I don't know who's illegal in here. I'm going to find out before I leave. And they could be sitting beside you in some of the most sensitive areas of your economy and you not know it. I didn't say 10%, I didn't say 20%, I said what? 40 to 45% come from all over the world and could be sitting right beside you. Understand that it's a much more complicated thing than we're talking about here. My more general question point is that immigration is playing a greater role in our society today. You see, we kept it relatively low until the mid-1960s. You see that take off. 42 million, I just saw the 2015 numbers, about 45 million people here who are foreign-born today. You might ask the question, well, who are these people? Well, about 46% of them are indeed Hispanic. You see the second largest population are Asians alone. Note that only about 18% of the immigrant pool is non-Hispanic white. If you looked at these data prior to 1965, those numbers would have been flipped because we had that preference for people from Europe and the like. When I talk about the browning of America, that's what I'm talking about. How big is this thing going to be? Well, when you filled out your census form in 2010, they asked you to self-identify. You know, 2 questions. One question was, are you Hispanic? If you were Hispanic, you checked that box. And if you said, no, I'm not Hispanic, you check the not Hispanic box. But then they kind of say, well, if you're not Hispanic, what the heck are you? Are you non-Hispanic white? Are you non-Hispanic black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or are you a person of 2 or more races? I already showed we added about 27 million people to our population during that first decade of new millennium. You will note that 15.2 million of that 27 million people, the net gain was Hispanic or Latino. You can note that go up to the top right above the yellow-white line, that about 12 million people were non-Hispanic, but the number I want to draw your attention to is the net growth in the non-Hispanic white population. We added 2.2 million people who were non-Hispanic white, growing at a rate of 1.2%, when the Hispanic Latino population was growing at 43%. And you note between the white and the Hispanic, all of those are people of color, and everybody's growing at double digits except the Native Americans, and that's 8.6%. That's close enough to double digit for government rate. That's when I'm talking about the browning of America. I'm talking about the source of your growth and where it's going to come from. It is a function of those kinds of changes in our population that we see all of these things happening. Here in California, wow, I mean, 3.3 million people added to your population. Net, you lose 860,000 whites, but you gain 3 million Hispanics and you gain 1.21 million Asians. That is, and losing blacks, that's what's driving change in the population here in your state. So you're a leader and a bellwether in terms of the kinds of changes that we're talking about in the population. When I talk about the browning of America, I say, well, what share of this net growth is everybody but non-Hispanic whites? So the non-white share 92% of that 27 million people was non-white, and 55% of it was Hispanic. Those are the migration magnet states below that whole line there. If you go to the 12 million people we added since 2015, 95% of it is non-white, and 48% of it was Hispanic in terms of the kinds of changes that we're talking about. That's what I mean by the browning of America. This is so important to our future, ladies and gentlemen, because what you have to understand, this browning thing, is so important to our future because you have to understand that immigration and migration are age-selective processes. What does that mean? It means far more young people migrate and immigrate than older people. It doesn't mean old people don't move. They move slower and at a lower propensity than young folk. There's one more piece to this story. Please don't repeat this anywhere because you could lose your job. In fact, I'm denying I say this before I say it. Young people are more likely to have children than old folks. Okay? You put those two things together, age selectivity of people coming in, higher fertility, it impacts the age structure in your society. Look at the data. What was the median age of the U.S. population in 2014? It's about 38 years old. Okay? Half of us older than that, half of us younger than that. What was the median age of a Hispanic Latino in America? Last row. 28 years old. Okay? Now, how many of you all have heard that Hispanics are a burden on the healthcare system in America? What kind of major health problem do you have when your median age is 28? Now, before you answer that, somebody tell me what the median age of a white non-Hispanic is in America up there. 43. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're in your 20s, you have usually acute health crisis. You stick your finger in the lawnmower, you got to go to the doctor and get it glued back on. But when you move from your 20s to your 40s, your health crises move from acute to what? Chronic. Which one costs the most? Trust me, I know. I lost my wife to cancer at 48 years old. Her treatment in the last 6 months of life, $5,000 a week. Okay? Just lost a dear friend to get rare form of throat cancer at 62. His treatment, $17,000 a week. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of the stuff you hear makes no sense. These are young people. It's a selective process, and you're going to need all of them moving forward to do what? Propel our nation, because I'm going to show you in a minute, we're aging. There's one more piece to this story, and this is for the ladies in the room. Ladies, you can tell the guys at your table to close their ears, but I think they really need to hear this, okay? Ladies, there is something in demography called completed fertility, okay? I won't give you the big theory, but if you do want it, come to Chapel Hill, pay us $100,000 a year, I'll tell you it all. Let me give you the pop version, ladies, of completed fertility. It's when you tell your husband, go take out the trash, ain't nothing else happening here. Okay? Completed fertility for women occurs between the ages of 40 and 44. Okay? There's this precipitous drop in fertility in those years. What's the median age of a non-Hispanic white female in America? 42 years old. What's the median age of a Hispanic female? 29. Now, between the 41 and the 29, those are all women of color. And you will note a 10 to 20 year gap in the median age. Do you know what that gap is? That's your fertility gap. We know exactly where kids are going to come from in the future. Now, I know that some of y'all in your 40s tomorrow, I'm going home and fix this tonight. Go ahead. Leave now. At every stoplight out there, let it cycle through 3 or 4 times. Get all the rest you can get. You might go home and squeeze out one, but you're not going to do what a 29-year-old going to do. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a fundamental to our future in our society. You can't grow if you're aging out of the childbearing years. Understand that. You got no market. You got no customers if what? You build a wall around your country and keep everybody out, and you're aging. The only thing you got left is the Bengay crowd. Understand, until we connect aging on the one hand and immigration on the other hand, that's the key to our future in society. This is a fundamental kind of change for us, this aging. Understand that it's inherent in those kinds of things. And in California, it's even worse. because your Hispanic population is about 29, but your non-Hispanic white population, median age of women is 47 years old. 47, you got it? Yeah, 47. I mean, ain't no action there. Fun, but no action. I expect you to have 2 the next time I come. And I'm coming, what's 9 months from now? So we're talking about a heck of a color adjustment in our population due to this demography. Look at the data. In 1990, 66% of all births in America were to non-Hispanic white families. That dropped to 50% in 2008. For the first time in history, in 2011, non-Hispanic white births were no longer the majority, dropped below 50%, and we don't think it's going to go the other direction because of this aging dynamic that we're talking about. You see where the growth is going to come from among these people of color. That undergirds the browning of America. So we're talking about a heck of a color adjustment in our population. In 2005, 67% of the population was non-Hispanic white. 10 years earlier, it was about 74%. We now think by about 2050 that the white share of the population is going to drop below 50%, hovering around about 47%. That's what this browning of America is all about in terms of the kinds of changes that we find ourselves in the midst of. At the same time that immigration has transformed the complexion of society, our society is also graying. At the same time that browning is occurring, our society is graying. Whereas immigration drives browning, graying is about the aging of our native-born population, okay? So it's probably a fair question to ask, well, how do we know? How do you know if you're part of the graying of America? 4 ways, okay? Number 1, if you have difficulty seeing this screen, you're part of the graying of America. Number 2, if you got to go to the restroom twice during this presentation, part of the graying of America. And number 3, if you fall asleep, you're just an old codger, it ain't my fault, you're part of the graying of America. Graying is about enhanced longevity, declining fertility, and a group of us who were born between 1946 and 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living much longer today than we ever anticipated when Social Security was instituted in 1935. The average person turning 65 in 1935 was going to live another 12.7 years. That person turning 65 today is going to live another 18.7 years to about age 83. And we now think living to 100 on a routine basis is well within a reach in American society. And there's one school of thought that says the person who will live to 130 has already been born. Why? Well, we've got major medical advances that does what? Extend our life. Y'all are eating better some of the time. Y'all are being more active some of the time. And now we got this thing called regenerative medicine. We have a scientist in North Carolina that has regenerated a bladder. So your bladder wear out, we'll sell you another one. You just tell me what color you want. We're working on every body part now, and this thing called longevity of extending life, we think that there will be well over about 600,000 centenarians in this country. I just saw some new numbers that up to between 750,000 and 1 million people 100 or older in this country. And globally, it's even bigger in some of these societies because we got these longevity hotspots around the world, about 5 of them, where people live forever in terms of these kinds of things. How do you age like that where fertility rates are down for women? This room is a powerful statement. Ladies, when you all become educated and career-oriented, what happens to the age at marriage? Goes up, right? What happens to the age at first childbirth? Goes up. When those 2 things go up, it reduces the number of years that it's safe to have children, so it depresses fertility, and you can see it if you have that 30-year view of that 40 to 44-year-old group of people where you see fertility change dramatically. About 10% of women in 1976 who were 40 or 44 didn't have any children at all. You fast forward 30 years, it went from 10% to 20%. Not even having children. The average female had 3.1 children, 40 to 44-year-old in 1976. That's above replacement level. Fast forward 20 years, it dropped to below replacement level. And so when you're below replacement level, you need to have, in a statistical sense, if you're a couple, 2.1 kids to replace yourself, okay? Don't ask me about the 0.1, you just got to be rocking and rolling, okay? So if you look at the data, If you need 2.1 kids to replace yourself, who's replacing themselves in America? You got one group, folks. You got one group. You build a wall around your country and send everybody home. Non-Hispanic whites have had a total fertility rate between 1.7 and 1.9 for 2 decades. Now, I quite frankly don't know how you get 0.9 of a kid. I taught a few of them at UCLA and another few at Chapel Hill. But remember, it takes 2.1 kids to replace yourself. You cannot grow if you're not doing what? Replacing yourself. So understand, this is not trivial. This is at the bottom of your business line when you start talking about these kinds of changes that we find ourselves in the midst of. And then there's a group of us born between 1946 and 1964. Let me see a show of hands. 1946, 1964. Look around. Everybody who has their hands up is part of the post-World War II hormonal rush in America. Okay? Our fathers went off to World War II and came back home and got busy. Got busy to the tune of producing 81 million of us. We are the boomer generation. On January 1st of 2011, the first baby boomer born in America turned 65 and became eligible for what? Everything. Every day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, for the next 20 years, we boomers will be turning 65 at the rate of 8,000 per day. Every day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year for the next 20 years. That's that silver tsunami. That's the pig in the python moving through the economy and society. Look at the numbers. 45 to 64 in 2010, 81 million people, 19 million people, growing by 19 million people, 32% rate of growth. Note that the second most rapidly growing population was the 65-plus population. Why? That 65-plus person is living much longer today than in the past. That's longevity. But we got a slight problem. What happened to the 25 to 44-year-old population? It actually declined. Why would the 25 to 44-year-old population decline? Some of the debilitating diseases that beset boomers and pre-boomers later in life are now besetting Gen X and Gen Y earlier in life, leading to the early onset of death and disability. See, when you all are accountants, you know that what a pay-as-you-go social security system is, right? You're paying in, and somebody else is doing what? Spending your money, right? That's the way it works, right? Now, what needs to happen to those 25 to 44-year-olds in order for you to get something out? It needs to be what? Growing. And they need to be working every day, E-B-D-A-Y, as many jobs as they can get, paying into the what? System. But it's declining. You know what? Want to know one of the things that's driving it? That was the opioid crisis in 1999. That's it in 2014. 11,000 people hospitalized per day and 91 deaths. Who we taking out? People that you want doing what? Putting in. And how many wars have we fought in the last 20 years? Who gets taken out? Young people. Understand, ladies and gentlemen, that we're at crisis when it comes to these kinds of issues, because you need that population to be growing and working every day to sustain any of our social safety net programs for our citizens and for us as individuals. That's one of the big things. 8,000 per day, turning 65. You see the rest of it there. That's that whole longevity thing that we're in the midst of. But I don't want you to think that all old people are obsessing over incontinence, dementia, and memory loss and stuff of that nature. They're one mobile bunch. Look at them. Where are they headed? Where they headed? South. I gave a lecture at Cornell University about 3 months ago. There were 40 senior citizens in the audience. All of them wanted to come home with me that day. I said, don't come today, come tomorrow. The red states growing with elderly populations that are higher than the national average. And what's going on, older adults are leaving major metropolitan centers, headed south and to suburban kinds of communities in the south. If you can get, basically, there are amenity-rich areas that are growing with elderly migration. If you got a golf course, a planned community, water, mountains, those are the places. But the crucial determinant of where they go, you got to have world-class health care within a 30 to 45-minute commute. And so those are the places that are growing as a function of those kinds of changes in our society. But we leave some people behind. Those green counties are places where the young people have left, leaving behind an older population that's aging in place. In some of these places, deaths exceed births and out-migration exceeds in-migration. These counties are literally dying. They can't pay their bills because there are not enough working people there to support an aging population in many instances. This is one of the most important things for you all, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of your organizations, but because for the first time in history now, we have 4 and soon to be 5 generations in the workplace. Everybody from the pre-boomer, born in 1945 or earlier, who's most familiar and in love with the rotary dial phone, to you millennials who waltz into work at 10:30 in the morning with 2 buds in the ear whistling, and all you boomers who arrive at 5:30 a.m. because that's the way we roll. And the boomer looks at the millennial and says, look at that, that's a bad work ethic, come rolling up in here at 10:30 in the morning whistling. And the millennial takes the 2 buds out long enough to look at the boomer and say, you can't spell work ethic because I finished walking in the door what you've been navigating at since 5:30 this morning. And Mr. Pre-Boomer's still trying to get the first rotary dial call out for the day. And somebody's got to manage all of that, and most of you have an HR system that is a one-size-fits-all. We're not even thinking about it. We're not even thinking about it. When you look at those multi-generations, there's still people across, because, you know, we have recessions and things like that. People want to work longer, have to work longer and the like. So you got 4 generations, but you got an HR system that is not even in line with all of that. So 2 issues. Succession planning for you is going to be a big issue, because everybody that raised their hand, sooner or later, we got to go. Some of us know exactly the minute we got to go. Others, we got 2 bulldozers outside to pull them out, but we got to go. How do you replace all of us who have to go? And understand that the next generation can't look like you, because the marketplace is what? Changing dramatically in all of this. So understand that succession planning is a huge, huge issue. I'll give you some, I don't know your data. I did know it. I did some work for AICPA a couple years ago, but I don't remember. Let me tell you the data for my university, because I did the work for the. Who cared to estimate and guess what percentage of the UNC faculty are aging baby boomers? What percentage you think? A little high, 66%. How do you replace 66% of your workforce? And for our entire university system, it's 77%. See, that's that pig in the python doing what? Heading out. Heading out. And so succession planning, how do you think about recruiting the next generation of talent? And secondly, that's the warm bodies piece. The second piece of it is, how do you think about knowledge succession? You all are smart people. You've been around the block a time or 2. You got scars to show for it, and you got some successes. How do you ensure that that knowledge gets transferred to the next generation? That's knowledge succession piece, and so that's the really crucial thing in all of this. And also understand, the other big piece for you here is, child care won't be your big issue moving forward. What will it be? Elder care. And elder care is radically different from child care. Child care is actually pretty predictable. You drop your crumb snatcher off at daycare in the morning. You go pick them up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You may have to go at lunchtime if they do something they got no business, but normally that's pretty predictable. But ladies and gentlemen, if you have elder care responsibilities, you're going to have to, particularly if you have a loved one with Alzheimer's or dementia, you're going to have to figure out how to squeeze work in. Everybody in HR circles talk about work-life balance. We've thrown that out the door. We talk about work-life integration when you have elder care responsibilities. So I have 3 siblings, and we have, until we're down to 2, but over the last decade, we've had 8 family members between the ages of 84 and 97 that we were responsible for taking care of. And I'm going to be honest with you, some days I was afraid to pick up the phone. Not because, my loved ones, they just don't tell you the truth. They lie through their teeth. Not because they're dishonest, but because they're proud people. They don't want to tell you the truth about anything. It's 10:30 at night in February 2 years ago, 30 degrees outside in North Carolina. My 87-year-old uncle calls me and says his heat's not working. He lives an hour and a half from me. He's wheelchair bound, visually challenged. He says his heat's not working. And he says, I must be out of oil. I says, Uncle, you're not out of oil. I pay your oil bill. I said, that oil company's so afraid of me, they dug holes around your house and put oil in it. I know you're not out of oil. He says, well, maybe the system is broken. I said, I doubt it. We had just had it. We installed it 2 years early, and I had it serviced right before Christmas because I didn't want anything. I says, I doubt that. Now, he lives in an older house, and if you look at those thermostats back there on the wall, they are positioned and assume that you are standing upright to be able to manipulate it. But he is wheelchair bound, visually challenged, and he's got this little thing that he picks up things with. What has he done? He has turned the thermostat off, but he can't see well enough to figure out that he's turned it off. It's 10:30 at night, 30 degrees outside. He lives an hour and a half from me. I got an 8:30 class in the morning, and I got to do what? Drive an hour and a half to do what? Turn on the thermostat. And you say, well, why didn't you call somebody in the neighborhood and have them do it? Because he's the youngest cat in the neighborhood. That's elder care, ladies and gentlemen. That's elder care. That's a full-time job, and it's a huge, huge thing for us. I got to move really quickly. You all are even, look at you, your 65-plus population increased by 48% when the nation increased by 26%. Your boomer population increased by 42% when the nation increased by 33%. Your only saving grace is you're growing a little bit more rapidly, 25 to 44, but this thing is here. It's upon you in terms of the kinds of changes we're talking about. And don't think it's just us. Japan sells more adult diapers than they do baby diapers. China's got the 4-2-1 problem. They have a one-child policy for 20 years. That 20 years got what? 2 parents and 4 grandparents to look after. That's to give you some sense. You see the number of increase in the China population. For the first time in history, deaths exceed births in our population. We're going to be about 26% elderly by 2040. And for you, understand that this elder care I'm talking about is that 40 million people provided unpaid elder care in 2011 and 2012 at an estimated loss of what? $30 billion in work productivity. Because you have an HR system, one size fits all, and nobody's talking about these issues. So understand it's a big thing for you. And don't think it's just us old fuddy-duddies who have elder care. 10 million millennials have elder care responsibilities. And you'll say, well, how can a millennial have elder care responsibilities? Allow me to explain it to you. Assume for the moment that I'm 55 years old. I'm not. Okay? And assume in my 55th year I go through a midlife crisis. I didn't. And assume in my midlife crisis that I marry a 35-year-old. Heaven forbid. And assume in my midlife crisis with my 35-year-old we have a child. How old am I when that kid turns 20? Old enough for the kid to look at you and say, what the heck were you thinking? That's how you get there. That's how you. So don't assume that looking at your organization that who has elder care responsibilities, it can be all over the place when you look at 25% of these caregivers are between the ages of 18 and 34. I don't have time to do this. At the same time all of this is going on, I got about 8 minutes left here, so I got to get through this. Family life is changing. Understand that the other thing about our society that's changing and contributing to the browning of our America is a fundamental, profound change in marriage patterns. Out-marriage rate means you marry someone of a different racial or ethnic group than you belong to, doubled among new married people from about 7% of all marriages to about 15% between 1980 and 2008, and it went from 3% to about 8% of all marriages in currently married folk. Well, who's doing all this hooking up in strange ways here? Well, about 41% of those marriages are between Hispanics and whites. About 15% of them are between Asians and whites, and about 16% of the marriages, both parties are non-white. Note the black-white marriages are the smallest share. There's the other group, about 17%. I don't know who the heck they are, but they're having fun. And they're hooking up. What's the significance here? The second most rapidly growing population behind Hispanics in America are people who self-identify as 2 or more races. What does this mean? That the nice and neat little crucibles we're accustomed to putting people in won't apply in the future, and people won't allow you to what? Put them in those clusters. So be careful how you portray family life in your marketing and advertising today. Anybody remember the Cheerios commercial from a couple years ago at the Super Bowl? Black guy lying on a couch. His little mixed daughter rushes up. He's asleep and dumps Cheerios on his chest. Heart healthy. And then the camera shifts to the wife, and she's what? White. Anybody follow Twitter back then? Ooh. Oh, you know what broke loose. How dare you air this at the Super Bowl? But I like Cheerios. Ugly stuff. But the company wasn't that bothered by it. In fact, a year later at the Super Bowl, they had another commercial with the same family. The woman pregnant again. What are they saying? Get over it. This is America, and you're either going to get on the boat or you get run over by it. So understand we're talking about a profound change. This thing is adding to that brown. It's darkening the complexion of our society, and it will continue as we become more diverse. Living arrangements, really quickly here. Cooling water from grandma's well and grandpa's too is about one of the most rapidly growing household types of the first decade of the new millennium. Grandparents raising grandchildren, okay? If you look at all households with children, 3.8% increase first decade. No grandparents present, just parents and their kids grew by 1.4%, but both grandparents present raising grandchildren grew by 42%. Grandmother only raising increased by 9.3%. Grandfather only raising grandchildren increased by 28%. Now, you're probably thinking about your grandma and my grandma when I talk about grandparents raising grandchildren. Understand that half of these grandparents are between the ages of 30 and 50. What does that mean? Don't look all cross-eyed when one of your staff people walks up to you who's 32 years old, say, I need time off this afternoon to go to school to check on my what? Grandchild. It will be real. Now, there are some grandparents like yours. My grandmother was 97 when she passed away. That means she had an AARP card when I was born almost. Grandma, 87 years old. 14-year-old granddaughter got the car out cruising at 10:30 at night looking for a 30-year-old man. I didn't make that one up. That one happened in my own family. After my wife died, I took care of my mother-in-law for about 8 years, and we had a niece. Now, I don't know about California, but in North Carolina, we don't allow 14-year-olds to drive. And I don't think there's any state in this union that allows a 14-year-old to go looking for a 31-year-old man. You all have nowhere, well, maybe. You all have nowhere, but I like pinstripes. I'm lucky to be here that they ain't going the wrong direction today. Because somebody got to act in that, because Grandma, 87, can't get out of the rocking chair, and the 14-year-old got the car going. That's one of the responsibilities of all of this. So this is not trivial stuff. Understand that it's out there, and it is happening. I don't have time to deal with that. Households are changing dramatically in terms of same-sex couples with children and all of that kind of stuff. Be mindful of that. You can look at this on your own. Let me get to two things here really quickly. So I want to talk about the end of men for you, because that's the other piece of this thing, and then I'll sit down and shut up and go back home. Good news first. Women are about to surpass men as the numerical majority in the paid workforce in America. Paid workforce. Women have been working all their lives, paid workforce. But ladies, before y'all start jumping up and down, this is not because we've decided to treat you all fairly. Okay? Still a huge gender wage gap out there, right? What, 86, 83, 84 cents on the dollar? Something like that? Something like that. Rather, this reality is because men are doing so poorly in American society today. Let's look at it. Look at the Great Recession. 80% of the job loss among men. Some economists call it a man session, because they're concentrated in those sectors that were most vulnerable to the downturn. But this in the men thesis goes much deeper than just the Great Recession. Today, 3 times as many men of working age do not work at all compared to 1969. Why don't they work? They don't have the skills for a new economy, they're disabled, or they're what? Incarcerated. Disability rate doubled between 1970 and 2009. The median wage of the American male declined by about $13,000 after accounting for inflation. But most telling for you and me, after peaking in 1977, male college completion rates have barely changed over the last 35 years. The sex ratio in education has been 60% female, 40% male for a decade. I assure you at birth, the sex ratio is not what? 60-40. It's more like what? 50-50. We granted 572,000 more degrees to women than we did men in 2010 from higher education. So ladies, the good news is y'all looking good, educated, employed. The bad news is if you ain't hooked up, forget about it. Ain't enough eligible, marriageable males to go around. That's the end of men thesis. That's the end of men thesis. You want to see what it looks like? I don't have data for your schools. Let me give you my school, UNC system. The system as a whole, 16 campuses, is about 43% male. The predominantly white institutions are 45% male. The minority-serving institutions are 36% male, and the black schools, community colleges, 44% male. Where are the men? You can't have stable families, stable communities, stable anything with that kind of sex ratio. Where are the men? How many minutes? 5 minutes? Okay, good. I walked all the way here from California. I'm going to take as long as I want to. I'm not. I'm going to be respectful. 5 minutes, right? I'm going to give you a clue to it. Because you need something to keep you up at night. I'm serious. And this is it. At the intersection of graying on the one hand and browning on the other hand of our population is this pernicious thing that I call the triple whammy of geographic disadvantage. That's your human capital challenge moving forward. Let me develop it for you really quickly. First, I'm going to give you a racial typology of U.S. counties. Those counties right there are racial generation gap counties. What does that mean? In these counties, the adult voting age population are predominantly white, aging, empty nesters. But the school age population is predominantly non-white. What support for public education you think you get there? That's the ain't got no dog in the K-12 education fight. My kids are out of school. I'm most concerned about what? Crime, safety, and retirement amenities, and they typically vote what? Self-interest, okay? Those counties are majority-minority counties. The adult voting age population is predominantly non-white. School age population is predominantly non-white. Lots of interest in public education. What's missing? They're all low-wealth counties, not enough money there for a world-class education, okay? The rest of the counties up there, the gray ones, everything that's gray are majority counties, where the adult voting age population is predominantly white, and the school age population is predominantly white. But in those school districts there, about a fifth of the kids who go to school there are kids of color. But if you peer beneath the veneer of those school districts and get inside, what you will find with the kids of color, the new majority in our society, are either attending racially isolated schools within those districts or in the quote-unquote good schools. They are underrepresented in the college prep tracks, honors, AP, IB, and the like. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, I painted a picture for how our population is going to change, and the kids of color are between a rock and a hard place through no fault of their own. Okay? That's whammy number one. Whammy number two is at the census tract neighborhood level. This is segregation. Those neighborhoods right there are 60% or more non-Hispanic white. Those neighborhoods are 60% or more non-white. And the yellow ones are transitioning from white to non-white. We call that hyper-segregation, separate and unequal, and probably rivals the segregation that existed in the year Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, the year I was born. Okay, hypersegregation. Third whammy, school-age poverty. Kids in those neighborhoods there, from those neighborhoods, growing up in households where 40% or more of the households in these neighborhoods have incomes below the poverty level. Those neighborhoods, between 25 and 39% of the household kids are growing up in households with incomes below the poverty level. We combine those two things, we call that concentrated poverty. Okay? The yellow, concentrated affluence. Those neighborhoods have poverty levels below 25%. When I talk about the triple whammy of geographic disadvantage, that's what I'm talking about. The average kid that walks in a public school system door today are up against those kinds of challenges. They're either attending schools in districts where there's little political or financial support for them, or they're devastated by concentrated poverty and hypersegregation, racial isolation, and the like. How many kids? 9.8 million kids, all three of those things, and that population is 93% non-white. For two of those things, say hypersegregation and concentrated poverty, 12 million kids, 81% non-white. Any one of those things, about 20 million kids, 39% non-white. And for no whammy, 32 million kids, life is pretty good, but there's only 24% non-white. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the key to our future, because this is the generation that has to propel us down the road, and I wish it just stopped right there, but it doesn't. Those are food deserts. We built our own school for vulnerable children in North Carolina, and I was at the school one day at pickup time talking to three little girls, and I made the mistake of asking a little girl, I said, "What did you have for dinner last night?" And she looked at me and she says, "Last night was not my turn to eat." She says, "At our house, we rotate who gets to eat dinner, and I get to eat every third night." Now, I'm in the Research Triangle Park, all that in a bag of chips plus dip, And you get kids who get to eat every third night. That's the next generation, folks, that has it. And I wish it stopped there. Those are suspensions. 3 million kids suspended from school annually, and 250,000 of them referred to the police for misdemeanor charges as early as the first grade. It used to be the third grade, it's first grade. A little kid in Apex, North Carolina, threatened his teacher with the first grade scissors. He got a misdemeanor charge for it. And I've been out of public school for a long time, but I still remember my first grade scissors. First of all, they were rounded, dull as you know what, wooden cut construction paper. And you got a teacher can't handle a first grade kid. And that becomes a scarlet letter of everything, because it's in your record and it goes everywhere with you. And there are places you can't even qualify for a scholarship. Those are the black kids, those are the Latino kids, and all of this stuff that is going on. I'm stop there, but so, ladies and gentlemen, I think our challenge in disruptive demographics is understanding that, not framing these issues as moral issues, but rather this strikes at the heart of our competitiveness moving forward. You cannot thrive and prosper if we leave this generation behind. You got no customers, you got no workers, or anything. Until we link the browning of America on the one hand and the graying of America, and understand that those two things are connected in a serious way, we're going to be in deep, deep yogurt in America. You cannot reproduce your way out of this situation. You are too old. No offense. I'm one of them. I know. I'm tired. My knees hurt. You got 2 seconds for a question, or do I need to go home?
Any questions? I'm sure there has to be some out there. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
What are some of the potential solutions? What should we look forward to do at this point to address these issues?
I really think the key particularly for those of you who are, all of you are in the accounting business. I think the key to our future is K-12 education. I think you have to be engaged in K-12 education. You do not develop an accountant at the high school level or college level, because the fundamentals are where? Elsewhere. I teach in a Master's of Accounting program, and I can tell you the number of diverse candidates that we have are between few and far in between. You got to be actively involved in K-12 education. And, you know, most of these kids never had an encounter with an accountant. It ain't like y'all on TV every day. Right?
Right.
Yeah. Name me an accountant on TV. Huh? Who? I don't even know who he is. But y'all know what I'm talking. I mean, you know what I mean. I'm not, because I love you all. I mean, you keep us out of white collar jails. I know that, but I think our future hinges on this. The other thing that I would say is that politically, we cannot frame these issues as social or moral. We have to be able to make the business case for why it's important to invest in these issues. At the end of the day, you got no customers if you leave these kids behind. You just don't. It's the most fundamental thing in the world. Kid born today, 5 years, not going to be walking into a school system. Fast forward to when they graduate from college, they become what? Hopefully, either your workers or your customers or something. That got to frame it in a way when you are talking to your elected officials, when you're talking at your cocktail party and the like. Got to get people to understand this is a competitiveness issue for us. You cannot thrive, prosper, and compete moving forward by leaving a whole generation of kids behind. Fundamental. It's fundamental. Yes, sir.
I do some volunteer work with kids, and we deal with charter schools sometimes, and some of them are just really good.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just wondering what your feeling were, because we hear horror stories where they're basically just, you know, in it for the money and the kids get shafted. And then there's ones that I've dealt with that are very promising.
Right. Well, I run a charter school. Okay. I have a charter school called Global Scholars Academy. And it's actually a laboratory school. It's a beta test site for new ideas and innovations for how you educate vulnerable children. We're extended day, we're year-round, we never close during intersessions. We teach Mandarin Chinese beginning in kindergarten. We have concentration in cybersecurity, forensic accounting, food systems, a whole range of things where we think the demand is going to be in the economy moving forward. So hopefully we're trying to build a model that's scalable someplace. You're absolutely right. There are some people that are in it for the money, and most people don't know there's a lot of unethical stuff that goes on in the charter movement. For an example, in the state of North Carolina, I think in most states, all charter schools have to do a lottery for their spots. So every kid's supposed to have equal opportunity of getting in. Well, a lot of charter schools, after the kids get in the lottery, they engage in something called post-lottery screening, where they screen out the kids that they don't want. We just finished an evaluation of a school that's got 55 charters. They screen out about 50% of the kids. It's the most unethical thing in the world. The ones they don't want, they push out, taking public dollars to do it. We don't do that. It's an ethical thing, but we got to be involved, and I take my hat off to you for doing that. And the other thing that you all have to do, we have to convince aging empty nesters that they do have a dog in the K-12 education fight. It's called the future competitiveness of our nation. And I thought long and hard how to communicate that to my fellow aging empty nesters. And the way I say it, I'm going to try it on you all. Says, you know what? Sooner or later, you're going to need somebody to take care of your old butt. You do want them to be able to count your pills. You do want them to be able to count your pills. I can show you kids that we graduate every day that can't count pills. That's not the ones who drop out along the way, the ones who got literally paper walking through that can't count pills. Until we frame it as a competitiveness issue, I think we're going to lose. Understand that this is the next generation that has to take care. We're going to need 1.25 million senior care workers by 2025, an additional 1.25 million. You do want them to be able to count your pills. Fundamental. Fundamental. Until you frame it as we're going to lose our shirt in the global marketplace, nobody's listening. I don't think people are moved by moral appeals anymore. I just don't. Yes, sir.
Joe Forlenza, San Diego chapter.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. It was a great talk, Doctor. One thing, you have all the three whammies. Maybe a fourth one that's coming up is technology, artificial intelligence, automation. Is that a fourth whammy?
But that's equal opportunity whammy. You're going to get zapped by that one, too. All of us. Yeah. So it's a very good question. So the question about where we're headed, I have another talk that I do about preparation for an unsparing global economy where the new normal is certain uncertainty. Okay? So what do you need in your toolkit to weather certain uncertainty? So we talk about a toolkit of nobody would doubt that you need the analytical reasoning skills that come with a STEM education. That's necessary but not sufficient. You need entrepreneurial acumen in this economy. You need contextual intelligence. You need impeccable soft skills and cultural elasticity to move fluidly from one environmental milieu to another. And you need the agility and flexibility to constantly reinvent yourself because the new normal is certain uncertainty. I am told by CEOs that they're looking for workers today who can groove on ambiguity because that's the nature of the landscape. We want people today who can see around the corner well before they get there. What did the famous hockey player Wayne Gretzky say when they asked him what was the key to his future and his success in hockey? What did he say? He said, I don't skate to where the puck is, I skate to what? Where it's headed. We want people today who are skating not to where the puck is, but rather what? Where it's headed. That's a mindset. That's a mindset. And I firmly believe in the power and creativity that exists in our society. But right now, we put kids in a box in our public school system, and when they don't fit, we say they have attention deficit disorder. Creative people have attention deficit disorder by definition. They're always on to what? The next thing. They drive you crazy. They drive you crazy. We need more attention deficit disorder in America. So I think, I don't know what the next great thing is, but I still think that just like the AI revolution, there's something else that if we unleash the entrepreneurial acumen and the power, I think we'll be just fine. Yes, ma'am.
Brooke Salvini from the Central Coast.
Yes.
And in some other presentations on similar topic and talking about competitiveness and demographics, I've heard that the US is actually in a better position than Europe, China, that also has the heavy grain. So how do you compare us and stack us up to the rest of the world?
They're definitely aging faster, and they've had a history of being more draconian on immigrants than we have. But understand, ladies and gentlemen, we want to cut legal immigration by 50%, from 1 million a year to 500,000, given all that I'm doing. We have refused to figure out how to regularize the 11 million unauthorized immigrants who otherwise haven't broken a law. We need all of those workers. And now we're constraining refugees and the like. You cannot reproduce your way out of this situation. Y'all can't have enough babies to make me happy. Because I need them to walk into the school system so I can do what? Teach them. Can't do it. Understand that this is so crucial to our future. Everything hinges on it. Because if AI is going to do, I mean, we were talking about at the table about, you know, I guess you all had a speaker that talked about AI and a society in the future where no one works, the leisure class. Last time I looked to be leisure, you got to have some cash. Where's it going to come from? It's the old basic, non-basic formula in economics. You need a basic economy so you can go to the movie on Friday night. Got to figure it out.
We have enough time for one more question if there's any additional questions out there. Okay, so let's give Dr. Johnson a hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you.